General Hospital spoilers tease that the revelation hit Marco like a thunderclap. Blaze's confession that he was the son of Sunny shattered the foundation of his identity in a single, irreversible moment. For years, Marco had operated on the edges of Port Charles, loyal to his own quiet sense of justice, always believing he was the orphan of a forgotten past. Now, in the blink of an eye, he was a Corinthos, bound by blood to the very man he had once viewed as untouchable and distant. The emotional weight of this truth, raw, complex, and inescapable, triggered a tidal wave of internal reckoning. But what truly began to reshape the course of Marco's world was not the truth of his lineage, but the monstrous lie that surrounded Natalia's death. In the shadows of this emotional revelation, Marco uncovered the unthinkable. Sidwell had orchestrated Natalia's murder and planted the evidence to frame Sunny. The very man Marco had just discovered was his father was being systematically dismantled by a sophisticated and insidious plan, all while grieving the loss of a woman he once loved. The horror of that knowledge pierced Marco deeper than anything before. He had nearly lost his sister Christina in the Charlie's pub fire, had saved her from death with his own hands, and now he realized that the same architect behind that blaze was also the one who had stolen Natalia's life, and worse, had twisted the crime to vilify Sunny. This knowledge consumed Marco with a terrifying urgency. The manipulation, the deceit, the callousness of using Natalia's death as a political tool, it all revealed the deeper rot Sidwell had seeded in Port Charles. What began as a personal revelation now grew into a mission of reclamation. Marco no longer saw himself as a disconnected outsider. He was a son, a protector, and now, perhaps, a soldier in a war he had never asked for but could no longer ignore. Sidwell's plan to destroy Sunny wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. By crafting the illusion of Sunny's guilt in Natalia's death, Sidwell hoped to collapse every pillar that supported Sunny's world: family, loyalty, public perception. Marco understood now that his father wasn't just being attacked legally or criminally, he was being surgically dismantled emotionally and symbolically. The betrayal ran so deep that it threatened to rip apart the very idea of who Sunny was. And Marco, now tangled in that same bloodline, refused to let it happen. But the psychological toll was enormous. Marco wasn't sure if he was reacting as a man seeking truth or a son desperate for connection. The trauma of learning the truth about his parentage collided violently with the revelation of Sidwell's treachery, creating a mental storm that left him restless, angry, and dangerously motivated. His world, once structured around justice and calm resolve, now spun with volatility. He found himself looking over his shoulder, tracing Sidwell's every move, reliving Natalia's last days in his mind, obsessively searching for the flaw in the plan, the moment it all went wrong. This personal awakening was not just about vengeance. It was about identity. For Marco, knowing he was Sunny's son meant carrying the legacy of both strength and contradiction. It meant inheriting not just Sunny's name, but his enemies. And now, with Sidwell in his crosshairs, Marco began to understand what it truly meant to be a Corinthos in Port Charles, a target, a survivor, and above all, someone who could no longer afford to look away. The adjustments happening in Marco's psyche were violent and transformative. What had begun as a quiet journey of service in the shadows was now a roaring inner reckoning. He could not protect his father without exposing himself. He could not stop Sidwell without embracing the power he never asked to inherit. And in the midst of all this, he carried the ghost of Natalia, a woman whose death could either destroy Sunny or ignite Marco's transformation into something far more dangerous than Sidwell ever anticipated. In the end, Marco knew that blood meant nothing if it wasn't defended. And now, he would defend it, with fire, with fury, and with the truth no matter how much it cost him. Because this wasn't just about Natalia's death anymore. It was about Marco claiming the legacy that had been denied to him his entire life and confronting the shadows that threatened to consume everything Sunny had ever built. The story was shifting rapidly, descending into an emotional and psychological battlefield where truths once buried were now erupting to the surface, reshaping everything in their path. Marco, who had spent weeks caught in a whirlwind of betrayal, fury, and moral ambiguity, was now beginning to see the full picture, and with that clarity came a devastating realization. His attempt to confront and possibly take down Sunny had been a mistake. A grave, consequential miscalculation that nearly severed ties to the one man who, as fate revealed, was his father. What had once felt like righteous indignation, a need to hold Sunny accountable for Natalia's death and the surrounding chaos, was now unraveling under the weight of new evidence, deeper context, and the manipulation that had poisoned the entire narrative. The suppression Marco once believed was necessary, the force he thought he had to unleash against Sunny, had come not from justice, but from emotional confusion and the poisonous whispers of Sidwell. And now, every step Marco had taken in his campaign against Sunny began to feel like a betrayal, not just of a man, but of his own blood, his own legacy. This was more than just a change of heart. It was a seismic adjustment to Marco's worldview. The world he had built, one where Sunny was the villain, where Natalia's death was the inevitable consequence of Sunny's criminal past, was crumbling. And in its place, a more terrifying truth emerged: Marco had been a pawn. Used. Weaponized. Not just against Sunny, but against himself. Sidwell had planted seeds of vengeance in Marco's path, allowing grief and rage to cloud his judgment. And now that the smoke was clearing, Marco was left staring into a mirror reflecting a man he barely recognized, one driven by emotion rather than fact, one dangerously close to becoming what he had sworn to oppose. The psychological toll of this revelation was profound. It wasn't just guilt, it was self-betrayal. Marco had spent his life pursuing justice, operating with restraint and logic, trusting that the truth would always be enough. But now, he saw how easily the lines between justice and revenge could blur, especially when the stakes became personal. The restraint he once prided himself on had been consumed by the storm Sidwell had engineered, and Marco had danced on the edge of destroying the one bond he never knew he needed, the bond with Sunny. This shift wasn't quiet, it roared within him, a storm of regret and newfound resolve. The oppressive weight he had placed on Sunny had blinded him to the actual threat that had always lurked in the shadows. Sidwell hadn't just killed Natalia, he had weaponized that death to fracture Sunny's world from the inside out. And Marco, unknowingly, had played his part. That knowledge changed everything. It forced Marco to recalibrate, to confront the uncomfortable truth that his path forward would not be vengeance, but redemption. The suppression that once defined his actions gave way to accountability. Marco knew he could not erase what he had done, but he could redefine what came next. He could expose Sidwell. Not for vengeance, but for justice. He could stand beside Sunny, not out of guilt, but out of understanding. And he could fight, not for a version of the truth fed to him through manipulation, but for the truth he had finally seen with his own eyes. This was one of the most dramatic emotional corrections Marco had ever faced. It changed not only how he viewed Sunny, but how he viewed himself. It forced him to reassess every decision, every assumption, and every alliance he had made since Natalia's death. And with that reassessment came power, not the raw, destructive kind, but the quiet, unshakable kind that comes from finally understanding who the real enemy is. Marco's internal shift signaled a broader change in the landscape of Port Charles. With every step he took away from blind rage and toward clarity, the tides began to turn. The oppressive narrative Sidwell had tried to impose was cracking, and Marco was no longer its prisoner. He was now its undoer. The adjustment was total, the change irreversible. Marco had found his purpose not in destruction, but in truth, and that truth was about to reshape everything. Marco and Sunny, once destined to remain on opposite sides of a brutal emotional chasm, now found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy who had manipulated them both into near destruction. The revelation that Marco was Sunny's biological son had detonated like an emotional landmine, shattering everything Marco believed about himself, his past, and his place in the world. But that bombshell was only the beginning. The far more destabilizing realization came with the knowledge that Sidwell, the very man who had positioned himself as Marco's mentor, father figure, and liberator, had been the architect of Natalia's death all along, and worse, had tried to pin the crime on Sunny. That betrayal cut deeper than any lie Marco had ever known. And it transformed his anger towards Sunny into a silent fury against Sidwell that would not be ignored. At first, Marco had been consumed by grief. Torn between rage and denial as Blaze stood trembling beside him, revealing truths that she had kept hidden for far too long. Her confession, that Sidwell was behind the poisoning of Natalia. That the guards who were supposed to protect her had been plants, and that Sidwell had been manipulating both him and Sunny from the beginning, left Marco reeling. Every instinct inside him screamed to confront Sidwell immediately, to take revenge in the most violent and unforgiving way. But Sunny, having seen far too many wars end in ashes and regrets, stopped him. This wasn't just about vengeance anymore. This was about dismantling an empire of lies built on the corpses of family. The alliance between Sunny and Marco was fragile but electric. It was built not on trust, but on understanding. Two men who had been broken, who had lost more than they could ever recover. And who now saw clearly that Sidwell's game was far bigger than they had realized. With Jason, Brick, and Carly brought into the fold, they began the slow, methodical process of pulling apart Sidwell's operation from the inside out. Brick confirmed that Paul and Peter, the guards assigned to protect Natalia, were never vetted through Sunny's trusted system. They were ghosts, clean backgrounds, synthetic identities. And their loyalty was always to Sidwell. Their presence was the first domino in a long line of planted betrayals, including the doctored autopsy reports, the manipulated surveillance footage, and even the anonymous tips that led the PCPD to temporarily detain Sunny. And then there was Blaze. At the center of the unraveling mess. She carried a weight heavier than either Marco or Sunny could have imagined. Her relationship with Sidwell had not been just transactional or opportunistic. It had been coercive, rooted in fear, guilt, and debt. She had once trusted him, just as Marco had. But she had seen what he was capable of, how easily he could turn someone's love into a weapon. Blaze admitted she had been threatened into silence, that Sidwell had promised protection for her and her family in exchange for her compliance. She had known about Natalia's planned removal, but never believed Sidwell would follow through with actual murder. By the time she realized how far he was willing to go, it was too late. Natalia was dead. The only redemption left was to make sure Sidwell paid for it. Port Charles was shifting. Underneath the quiet facades of the Metro Court, the docks, and the Corinthos compound, a war was brewing. Sidwell had believed that by fracturing the Corinthos family and seducing Marco with lies, he could rise to power unchallenged. But in doing so, he had triggered something far more dangerous than he expected, unity born of betrayal. Marco had become the ghost of Sunny's past, equal parts punishment and redemption, but now he was transforming into something far more lethal, a partner. With each passing day, the alliance between father and son deepened. Marco used his connections inside Sidwell's tech empire to plant digital breadcrumbs, while Sunny's people began intercepting communications, tracking wire transfers, and mapping out Sidwell's criminal infrastructure. Jason shadowed Blaze, aware that her information was invaluable but also that she remained a wild card, tormented, unstable, and unpredictable. She had risked everything to expose the truth, but the trauma of her complicity and her love for Marco made her a dangerous variable. Then came the discovery of the safe house. Tucked away in the outskirts of the city, Sidwell had built a retreat stocked with surveillance equipment, counterfeit passports, and blueprints for something far more sinister, proof that Natalia's death was just one move in a long-term strategy to consolidate power and cripple Sunny's network for good. Sidwell hadn't just wanted revenge. He wanted legacy. And that legacy required erasing Sunny from the board entirely, publicly, painfully, and permanently. The night Blaze broke into tears and gave Marco the access codes to that safe house was the night everything changed. Marco no longer hesitated. He and Sunny launched a coordinated strike, not of violence, but of strategy. Evidence was delivered anonymously to the PCPD, implicating Sidwell in the manipulation of the forensic results. Brick leaked reports to the media exposing the inconsistencies in the autopsy. Jason sent encrypted messages to agents within the WSB, drawing attention to Sidwell's shadow dealings. Carly secured protection for Blaze, understanding that her testimony might be the final piece needed to bring Sidwell down, but also knowing she was now a target. And amid all this, Sunny and Marco stood at the edge of something no one expected. They weren't just allies. They were something more dangerous, family with a purpose. Marco no longer saw Sunny as a monster from his nightmares, but as the man who could help him destroy the real monster, the one who had taken everything. And Sunny, scarred by a lifetime of loss, now saw Marco not as a mistake or a liability, but as his legacy. Sidwell's empire would not fall in one night. But the cracks had started. The betrayal of Paul and Peter. The haunting confession from Blaze, the unity between Marco and Sunny, and the weaponized grief that now burned behind every move they made, it all led to one inevitable outcome. A reckoning. And when it came, Port Charles would never be the same again. Blaze and Christina had entered a realm beyond disillusionment, past heartbreak and even past survival. What bound them now wasn't mere sisterhood, but a profound understanding that they had been forged in the shadows of men who wielded power as casually as weapons. And together, they had come to a final decision: no more silence, no more restraint, no more waiting for justice that never arrived. Their alliance, once grounded in healing and mutual support, had begun to take on a darker edge, as both women became consumed by a new purpose, one that didn't just challenge the order of Port Charles, but sought to raise it to the ground. Blaze, scarred from her time under Sidwell's manipulative control, had spent too long being the secret, the pawn, the afterthought. Her voice, once used to charm and please, had now become a weapon. Sharp and unyielding, ready to cut through the veil of lies that had held the town hostage for too long. But it was the secrets she still held, the ones she hadn't yet released, that gave her real power. These weren't just stories of infidelity or corruption. Blaze had documentation, recordings, encrypted communications, timelines, and money trails. She had proof of Sidwell's operations, proof of forged documents tying Sunny to Natalia's death, and even more damning, proof that select members of Port Charles's law enforcement had been compromised. She knew too much, and the weight of it had changed her. Christina, meanwhile, was on a journey of her own. The fire that nearly claimed her life had altered her permanently, not just physically, but psychologically. She had been forced to watch her father's enemies attack from the inside while Sunny remained blind to the extent of the rot. Worse still, she had begun to question whether Sunny was capable of protecting anyone anymore, not just her, but Blaze, Michael, or even the fragile piece in the Corinthos family. Her near-death experience had stripped her of illusions, and what was left behind was clarity. And that clarity told her that nothing would change unless she made a change. She had tried loyalty. She had tried silence. Now she would try fire. As their unity deepened, so did the danger. Blaze no longer waited for permission from Marco or Jason to move. She began coordinating anonymous tips, preparing secret files, even drafting statements that could be leaked to major news outlets if her plan went wrong. Christina arranged silent meetings, feeding Blaze insider information, some from Sunny's inner circle, some gathered from overheard conversations or family files she was never meant to see. Together, they formed a new kind of alliance, not a support group, but a resistance. And the target of their resistance, ironically, wasn't just Sidwell anymore. It was everyone who had played a part in the system that let him rise. It was Sunny, for turning a blind eye. It was Michael, for weaponizing morality when it suited him. It was Drew, for pretending to be a savior while orchestrating emotional manipulations. And it was Jason, for staying quiet far too long. The chaos they began to unleash did not go unnoticed. Marco, who had recently learned the truth of his own bloodline, that Sunny was his father, found himself pulled in opposite directions. The shock of that revelation had unmoored him. Everything he thought he knew about loyalty, justice, and identity had cracked. But what disturbed him even more was discovering that the man he had spent months trying to bring down was his father, not just in biology, but in burden. Sunny's sins were real. But Sidwell's were darker. The death of Natalia had shown Marco the true depths of Sidwell's ruthlessness. And now, knowing that Blaze and Christina were willing to destroy everything in the process of achieving justice, Marco realized he might be the only one standing between a slow-burning transformation and an all-out inferno. He tried reasoning with Blaze, pleading with Christina, even meeting with Jason and Carly in secret, trying to devise a way to neutralize Sidwell without letting the situation implode. But Blaze had already crossed a line. She had sent out encrypted threats to Sidwell's associates, warning that the next leak would be public and irreversible. She was ready to burn them all, because in her mind, burning was the only way to disinfect what had festered for too long. Christina, driven by her own need to see Sunny humbled, began preparing for something even more personal. Releasing a tell-all confession of her life as a Corinthos, exposing the emotional neglect, the gaslighting, the ways in which power had been prioritized over protection. And yet, even in the middle of this chaos, Blaze was haunted by the one thing she never expected: guilt. Not guilt for the consequences of her actions, but guilt that Marco was paying a price for truths he never asked for. Her love for him hadn't disappeared. It had merely been buried beneath layers of pain, betrayal, and vengeance. But now that she saw him grappling with the weight of being Sunny's son, of having defended Sidwell while unknowingly serving his mother's killer, something inside her softened. She began to wonder whether vengeance could coexist with redemption. Whether justice could come without sacrificing everything. Still, the machine they had built could not be easily stopped. Blaze's digital footprint was already primed to explode if anything happened to her. Christina's prepared statements were scheduled to auto-send. Sidwell, increasingly paranoid, had begun hiring private mercenaries and tracking Blaze's every move. He even considered framing Christina next, using the fire at Charlie's as a foundation for proving mental instability. But he underestimated the depth of their preparation, and the extent to which Port Charles itself was already divided, ready to pick sides in a civil war of legacy, power, and truth. As this slow-moving avalanche grew in intensity, one reality became clear: no one in Port Charles would emerge unchanged. Sunny would have to face the demons he had ignored for years. Marco would have to choose whether blood or principle defined him. Jason would have to confront the betrayal of someone he once saw as a sister. And Blaze, the woman everyone had underestimated, would stand in the center of it all, not as a victim, but as the catalyst. Port Charles was no longer a city of shadows and secrets. It was becoming something far more dangerous, a battlefield of truths, where the past refused to stay buried, and where those once silenced now roared loudest.